Good to have each of you here this evening. Many of you know what it means to repurpose something. You have no doubt in your life done that at one time or another. Used something that was already used for some other purpose, given it a new purpose or a new use. We often look around our houses and see things and are like, well, I'll probably use that sometime. I know Lauren claims I have a bag of screws in every drawer that I'm going to use someday for tools or tape measures, but in my defense, she's got fabric laying everywhere, so, and she uses that too. Tonight we're going to look at some fishermen who are going to be later on becoming fishers of men. And we're going to see they have a different purpose later on than what they have in the beginning. And we're going to start tonight in our text of Luke chapter 5, as John read just a little bit ago. But it is interesting to think about what these disciples go through and the things that are going on in their minds as they are following after Jesus and trying to figure out what's going on. And then, of course, we see how far it eventually goes after Jesus' death and resurrection. But here in Luke chapter 5, we find Jesus preaching by the Sea of Galilee. Peter and his brother Andrew are mending nets after they've spent a long night fishing. And the crowd is pressing in. And so Jesus, he gets into Peter's boat, sits down, and begins to teach. I guess you could argue that Jesus repurposes Peter's boat, but that's probably a different point. But so he's sitting in Peter's boat and teaching. And when he finishes his lesson, he tells Peter to put out in the deep and let down your nets for a catch. Of course, we know that they've already been fishing all night, and you can understand that thinking about Peter's response. Master, we worked hard all night and caught nothing, but we'll do as you say and let down the nets. And so suddenly, of course, they caught such a great quantity of fish that their nets began to break. So they signal their partners in the other boat and ask them to come and to help them. And both boats begin to sink because they have caught so many fish. Well, Peter falls down on his knees and he says, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." Jesus says, "Do not fear. From now on, you will be catching men." And so this path we find them on from fish to fishing for men, of course, is not going to be an easy one. It's not a matter of just flipping a switch and saying, "Oh, okay, that makes sense," But there's a lot of different hoops they have to jump through, and a lot of journey that's going on in their faith. And so as we look at this, I think we'll see some of our own struggles as well as we look at some different passages tonight that talk about the faith of the disciples. We're going to look at some doubting that goes on, and then, of course, kind of how it all comes together there at the end. But think about the growing faith of the disciples. In the account in Luke chapter 8, as well as Mark chapter 4, when Jesus stills the sea, Jesus says, "Let's go over to the other side of the lake." And as they're going, he falls asleep in the boat. Well, there's a big storm that comes up, and it's causing great waves to crash against the boat. It begins to fill up with water. And you can just imagine these seasoned fishermen, they're afraid. That probably take a little something for them to be afraid if they're being on the water for so long, so many years. But out of fear, they come to Jesus. "Master, Master, we're perishing." That's Luke's account. Mark's account, they say, "Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing?" And so Jesus gets up and he rebukes the wind and he says, "Hush, be still," or "Peace, be still." And the wind died down and became perfectly calm. He turns to the disciples and he says, "Where is your faith?" In Mark's account, he says, "Why are you afraid? How is it that you have no faith?" And they ask each other, and of course, this is the main point of each of these stories, what they are able to conclude. They ask each other, "Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" So you think about your growing faith, think about where you're at, you're seeing Jesus do these great things, and then you have to put it together. Who is this guy that even the winds and the sea obey him? Well, another account in Matthew chapter 14, This is after Jesus feeds the 5,000. He made his disciples get into the boat. This is Matthew 14:22. Makes the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, and he sends the crowds away. And then he goes up to the mountain to pray in verse 23. Well, meanwhile, the disciples are having kind of a difficult time rowing across the sea because the waves are beating against the boat. We find out it's somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m. So it's, that's late or early, depending on your perspective of things. And Jesus comes towards them walking on the sea. And while they see him, they are afraid because they don't think it's him. They think they're seeing some sort of a ghost, and they cry out for fear. Jesus tells them, "Take courage, it's I, don't be afraid." And then Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you onto the water." And Jesus says, "Come." Well, Peter gets out of the boat and he starts walking towards Jesus. He walks towards Jesus and he's looking at the waves. And again, it's 3 to 6 a.m. and all these waves going on around you. And I've always thought that'd be the hard thing, getting out of the boat and letting go of the boat and actually walking out towards Jesus. But at that point, he starts looking at all the stuff going on around him, and he begins to sink, and he cries out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus, of course, takes Peter's hand and pulls him up out of the water. But he says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And as soon as Peter gets into the boat, the wind stops. The other disciples say, "You certainly are God's son." Again, you have to be impressed with what they're seeing, what they're understanding here. And of course, there's a lot of examples of that in the scripture, and we're not going to go through every one, but it seems like at different points, the disciples kind of begin to understand a little bit about what's going on, although we're going to talk about some disappointing moments here in just a moment. But it seems like they begin to understand in some of the different ways. When they're in Capernaum, they're in John chapter 6. Of course, John chapter 6, a big chapter with Jesus talking about the bread of life and all these teachings to focus on the spiritual food and not on the physical. But he has these different hard teachings that he gives them. And it says in verse 66 that many of the disciples withdrew and were not walking with him anymore. And so they're kind of giving up. These are hard sayings. We're giving up. Jesus says to the 12, "You do not want to go away also, do you?" And remember these words that Simon Peter answers, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God." I mean, that's great. That seems like that's some progress right there, recognizing who Jesus is and where are you going to go? They've seen these great things that have taken place that he's done. They've seen these disciples leave, but they're not leaving. Where are we going to go? You have the words of eternal life. There in Matthew chapter 16 at Caesarea Philippi, Jesus poses the question, who do people say the Son of Man is? Well, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Jesus says, "But who do you say that I am?" "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." So here it seems like maybe some progress is made, and they're able to kind of grasp some of what is going on there. But as I mentioned, there's quite a few disappointing moments that go on where I'm sure, thinking from Jesus's perspective, you'd have to be, "Oh wow, they're not making as much progress as they need to, or they're not doing as good as I would have hoped." But think about the story in Luke chapter 9 with James and John there in Samaria, some of the final days of Jesus' ministry. Jesus and his disciples are on their way to Jerusalem. They're traveling through Samaria. He sends some messengers ahead to make some arrangements in one of the Samaritan villages so they could stay the night. However, the Samaritans would not let them stay because Jesus had his face set towards Jerusalem. And well, when James and John learned about this, how dare they? That's not very nice of them. And so they say in verse 54, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" That sounds reasonable, right? Don't you know who this is? This is the Lord. Why wouldn't you want to let him stay? Jesus turns and rebukes them and says, "You do not know what kind of spirit you are of, for the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." And I can't help but think you'd be kind of like, have you learned nothing? It's not why we're here, is to do something like this. And then we have it seems like continual arguments over greatness. Matthew chapter 18, Mark chapter 9, Luke chapter 9, and Luke chapter 22. There's these times when they're arguing over who is the greatest. Of course, you got 12 guys here together, and they're all following after Jesus, and that's what they're concerned about a lot of times, it seems like. Who is the greatest? I know we're all disciples here, but which one of us are the best disciples? That's the kind of the conversation that they're having. In Capernaum, Mark chapter 9, Luke chapter 9, they get into an argument over which of them is the greatest. Jesus takes a child, stands him by his side, and says in verse 48, "Whoever receives this child in my name receives me. Whoever receives me receives him who sent me. For the one who is least among you all, this is the one who is great." You know, we understand that they don't really want Jesus to know that they're talking about these things. That's not something they really want to be understood. The last time this happens is in Luke chapter 22, when they're on their way to the garden. And this is when Jesus is going to be arrested. This is when all these things are getting ready to go down. And there arose a dispute among them as to which one of them was to be regarded as the greatest, in verse 24. Well, among other things, Jesus says, "The one who is the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the servant." It's hard to just imagine. I mean, it's hard enough to imagine what Jesus is going through at this point in his life, knowing what's coming, knowing the difficulty that's ahead. And you have these men that you're going to be counting on to carry this on very shortly, and they're over there thinking about who's the greatest. Peter, James, and John asleep in the garden. Jesus knows that Judas is betraying him. He knows he's getting ready to be arrested. He needs some time alone with the Father. And so he and Peter, James, and John go to the Garden of Gethsemane, leaves the others on the outskirts while he takes them into the garden. He tells them in verse 34 of Mark chapter 14, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch." 3 times he goes off a little ways to pray. And 3 times he comes back to find them sleeping. There again, you think about what he's getting ready to go through, and you think about if somebody you were close to, asked you, "I need you to watch and pray. I need you to do this. There's some things going on that we really need to be focused on." And he finds them sleeping. The first time he says to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour?" The second time he comes back, Mark tells us that they just couldn't keep their eyes open. The third time he says, "Are you still sleeping and resting?" So you have to think about at this point, will these men ever become what Jesus wants them to become? Will they ever do what he needs them to do? I mean, how can you not be thinking along those lines? Of course, we have Peter's denial. On the way to the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus tells the disciples, "You will all fall away because of me this night." Of course, Peter, absolutely not. "Even though all may fall away because of you, I will never fall away." Verse 34 of Matthew 26, "Truly I say to you that this very night, before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter says, "Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you." And all the disciples in verse 35, they're like, "Yeah, us too. We're not going to deny you either." But we know later on, as Jesus is being led away by those who had come to arrest him, we find these words in Matthew 26:56 and Mark 14:50. They all left him and fled. Sad, sad words. We know that Peter and John are following at a distance as Jesus is taken back to Jerusalem to the home of first Annas, the high priest. John's able to get into the courtyard there and have Peter admitted as well. And Peter's confronted by three people. The slave girl who kept the door, she said, "You're not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Peter moves away from there to the fire where the slaves and the officers are warming themselves because it's cold. And some of them said, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" And he denied it and said, "I am not." Finally, one of the slaves of the high priest who had been in the garden said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Of course, he denies it again. And immediately the rooster crows. And it's at that moment, we're told in Luke's account, that Jesus is being led across the courtyard to the home of Caiaphas, and he turns and he looks at Peter. I mean, can you just imagine that? Just imagine what that must have been like. Peter, we're told, goes out and he weeps bitterly. Luke 22 and verse 62. We know that by the next morning, Jesus is nailed to the cross. By the afternoon, he dies on the cross. What happened? I mean, these are just a small amount of accounts that we have throughout the Gospels. But these men had been with Jesus for 3.5 years. They'd seen him perform many, many miracles that had never been done before. Peter, James, and John, they've been privileged to kind of be in this inner circle. They were in the home of Jairus. They watched Jesus raise up his daughter from the dead. They were there when Jesus was on the Mount of Transfiguration, seeing Elijah and Moses and seeing that conversation take place. Where was their faith in all of this? How could they abandon him now? Well, we're not going to end the sermon there, so it's going to pick up here. Spoiler alert. You know, all is not lost through all of this, and we find that after Jesus dies and after he is resurrected, we find that they're going to go do some more fishing. But on the morning of Jesus' resurrection, when the women get back from Jerusalem to tell the disciples, "Hey, the body's gone," they don't believe them. They don't believe the women. It wasn't until they see for themselves that they believe. But they go to Galilee as Jesus had told them to do, and there Peter decides to go fishing. Thomas, Nathanael, James, and John, 2 others from among his disciples in John 21, fished all night, caught nothing. Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? The next morning, they see a lone figure there on the shore, and this figure says, "Children, do you not have any fish?" And they said, "No." This individual said, "Cast the net on the right-hand side of the boat and you will find a catch." I mean, don't you know that's got to sound a little bit familiar to them as you think about what they've been through. But they still don't seem to realize who it is. But something happens, of course. They catch so many fish that they can't pull the net into the boat. John says, "It's the Lord." And Peter immediately puts on a garment and throws himself into the sea. He swims to the shore while the others are dragging the net behind the boat. They arrive at the shore. They see that this individual has a fire there. There's some fish already laid out. Jesus says, "Bring some of the fish that you've caught." Peter goes down to the boat, grabs a net. There's 153 fish that he pulls out of there. And of course, after that is when they have the conversation where Jesus says, "Do you love me?" 3 different times, and that conversation takes place. In all that took place there, what we see with Jesus is he doesn't give up on these men. They have all of these failings. They've seen all these things. They've done all this with Jesus and have seemed like they failed time and time again. But Jesus keeps on. He keeps on plugging away at them. He keeps on showing them a love that just doesn't stop. And so when you think about those events and all this time that's been going on and all these things that take place and all the disappointments that go on, of course, we see what's going to go on to happen. 50 days later, we're at the day of Pentecost. And, after Jesus' resurrection. And Peter and the apostles are going to stand there before thousands and thousands of people and preach a sermon. They're going to stand there after these people have come because they've heard some strange sound and are trying to figure out what it is that was the cause of that. No longer do we see a bunch of uneasy fishermen that don't really know what's going on, that are just ruled by fear and emotion. We see them with lives of renewed purpose. We see them fishing for men here, and we see what takes place. And as Peter draws this sermon to a conclusion, he says, "Let all the house of Israel know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified." And as we know, there are 3,000 that obey the gospel that day, that are baptized into Christ. And Peter and the rest of the disciples have become fishers of men. And so you see that transition that takes place. You see that great work that happens through their lives. And so much of the time, though, you're left there scratching your head wondering, are they really going to make it? Are they really going to be able to do this? But we don't see Jesus losing heart. We don't see him giving up on them. And we find him with confidence in what they're ultimately going to be able to become. And I just want us to think about, as we are closing here tonight, Jesus repurposing their lives for so much more and to be so much greater. And it seems like he doesn't have a whole lot to work with, but we know that things go pretty well after all of this, all things considered. But what I want to leave you with tonight is thinking about our own lives. Will we allow God to repurpose our life? Whatever our direction is in life, wherever we're at in life, what really should be our focus? Are we going to allow the Lord to have his way with us? If he can change men like Peter, Andrew, and James and John, and all the things we see that they've gone through, surely he can do something with us. And that's exactly what he desires to do to all of us. He wants us to put our will aside and conform our lives to his will. That's what he asks. But the reward, of course, is great. Tonight, as we close, will you choose to become a disciple of Jesus, to work with him, to bring others to Jesus? Will you choose to be a disciple of his, to have your sins forgiven, and understand what's at stake here, your soul, eternity, all that goes with that? You have the opportunity tonight to get your life right. If we can help in any way, please let it be known as together we stand and sing.
Would you be free from your burden of sin?